Hi everyone, this is Kim Nguyen. I'm most honored to be able to present at RSA Conference 2021 in this virtual experience. As I said, I'm Kim Nguyen. I'm the Managing Director of dTrust, which is a company of the German Bundesdruckerei Group. And I'm head of the CA business there. And I'm also a board member of Teletrust, which is the German IT Security Association. And I would like to welcome you very much to this presentation on Better Call Brussels, news on European cybersecurity and ID regulation. And of course, those of you who have seen Better Call Saul, they probably recognize the slogan here. So of course, Saul Goodwin, he is the lawyer to trust. And we are speaking a lot of trust here. So better get to the source of information and better call Brussels and see about new developments in Europe. And this is the landscape I'm going to present to you today. So I'm basically focusing my talk on the topic of trust services and electronic identification. And this is what the eIDAS regulation is actually focusing about. I've been speaking about this some years ago, and a lot has happened since then. So this will be the focus point. But the landscape is much broader. So actually, I'm going to go through other regulations first. I'll start with the Cybersecurity Act. I will also action on the NIS regulation, and I will also touch on the Digital Service Act, which is called DSA. And of course, privacy is always a big topic, and you all also know the data regulation topics in Europe, but this will not be the main focus of this talk today. So this is a virtual experience, but still feel free to use the chat. So I will try to incorporate whatever questions I see either at the end of the presentation or in between in the chat, what I see fit. So please feel free to make use of this as much as you like. Okay, so let's start this little walk in the regulatory landscape of the EU. And let's start with the so-called NIS, which is short for the European Union Network and Information Security Directive. So what are the main topics we are going to cover here? But in fact, of course, cybersecurity is a big topic right now. That's not a big surprise for anyone attending an RSA talk. But it's more interesting to note here that, of course, Europe, it's a heterogeneous landscape. So it's clear that the NIS in the version 2.0 that we see here, it's really aimed at improving cybersecurity capabilities at the national level. So national level means each country has to imply his national cybersecurity strategy, has also to implement a cybersecurity authority here. And the NIS is actually the framework under which this is going to happen. And of course, so much comes from cooperation. So another focus point here is really increase the cooperation between member states at the union level. So basically, there's a lot of throwing and froing in Brussels here on how to move things forward and how to really improve cyber resilience of public and private entities. And of course, resilience, very fittingly, the motto for RSA 2021. So improving cyber resilience, both in the public and the private sector, really is at the core of NIS. And in fact, there are 7 specific sectors, and there are 3 digital services that are addressed here. Okay, moving on from NIS, DSA is the next thing, Digital Service Act. So what is this about? Interestingly enough, I think it's interesting to see that the Commission is actually moving forward now more in an ecosystem view. So basically, what the Digital Service Act is about, it's really the question, how can you make the European common market a more safer and more cyber secure place? So basically, countering illegal goods, services, or content in online services is one of the main focus points here. So there is an obligation on traceability of business users in online marketplaces, very interesting topic. And of course, this has a very close connection to identification, which we'll come to in a few minutes. Basically, the focus here is also to really safeguard the user, to put in place effective safeguards for the users, including the possibility to challenge the content and some decisions that a platform can make. And of course, speaking of platforms, it's really important that under the DSA, there are certain transparency requirements you have to meet if you offer an online platform. And basically, securing platforms is one thing. Certification and audit is the other. So basically, for large platforms, there is the obligation to prevent misuse of their systems by actually implementing risk-based action and also by implementing independent audits. So the auditing, of course, here is a very important scheme to have like third parties in to secure the security and the resilience of the platform. And it's also important under an open data aspect that key data of the largest platforms has to be accessible for research topics. Of course, taking privacy into consideration, but access for research topics is quite important. And of course, in the end, there needs to be some oversight structure to really address this complexity. So where are we in this process? Well, basically, the discussions to find a common position on all this have started on council level in Brussels. And of course, given the complexity of what we see, it's still a process that will take some time until we see the first things. Okay, so having approached the digital services, we are going to move on to the so-called DMA, the Digital Market Act. And here we are. So basically, this is, again, a very much ecosystem-focused approach. The basic notion here is that they speak about a so-called gatekeeper platform. Yeah, so basically, this is a platform that allows users to access certain services. And basically, so there are some obligations that these gatekeeper platforms have to adhere to. I'm going through this step by step. So basically, the first thing is about interoperability. So basically, a gatekeeper platform has to allow third parties to interoperate with the gatekeeper's own services. Yeah, so this is actually interesting and important because it means you have to open up in certain situations, at least for specific situations. Secondly, the business users have to be allowed to access the data that they generate in their use of the gatekeeper's platform. So again, this is more or less an open data approach, which means we are talking about a more or less open ecosystem approach here. And finally, the third requirement that gatekeeper platforms have to adhere to is they have to provide tools to the companies necessary for advertisers to carry out independent verification of their advertisements. So this is again important, and I think once more it emphasizes the open data approach in the sense that there has to be independent access, independent verification of what the platform is actually doing. So this is the requirement side. Of course, regulations always deal with things you are not allowed to do. So here are the main three topics that the gatekeeper platform is no longer allowed to do. So basically, the first thing is more or less about just treatment, so to speak. So trier services and products offered by the gatekeeper itself are not allowed to be treated in a more favorably way. Yeah, so this is really an equal offerance of all services in the platform. And secondly, the platform is no longer allowed to prevent customers from linking up to business outside their platforms. Again, I think it's important to see here that the notion of the common market is an open one. So basically, the big platforms operating in this have to really open up for third-party business. And finally, also the platforms may no longer prevent users from uninstalling any pre-installed software or app if they wish so. So basically, this means, again, we are speaking about an open platform, open services, open tool chains. And this really emphasizes something that the European Commission has been very strong about. They really want to focus on open and interoperable platforms that leave the decision for services and tools with the user in the end. So again, this is a quite new regulation, and I think it's of special interest, of course, speaking at a US conference, because we all know that some of the big platforms have US origin, and of course, it's going to be interesting to see how this is in the end going to tie up with what the Commission is proposing right now. Okay, having said that, in the beginning I said I'm going to focus on the eIDAS regulation, on the topic of e-identification, and this is really the next big topic I'm going to introduce. So this is more or less the timeline that we've seen. So we are not speaking about a new regulation. Initially, the eIDAS regulation was adopted in April 2014, so quite some years ago. Coming from Germany, of course, it's interesting to see how is this going to play out. In the national situation, basically, things came into force in July 2014. And then there was a period of adoption, so to speak. And of course, in the years to follow, a lot has happened. An interesting cornerstone was summer last year, summer 2020, not only because Germany, in fact, took over the EU Council presidency, but also in the process of a regulation in Brussels, there's always a mandatory evaluation of the regulation, and this coincided, in fact, with the German EU Council presidency. So basically, in the last second half of 2020, a lot of discussions went on. It's also interesting to note that this is an open process, so it's a public consultation. So public consultation requests were given out for various topics and were then consolidated by the end of 2020. And we are now expecting, in fact, a proposal of what the revision of the eIDAS regulation will look like, and this is most likely to happen in the next quarter. And it's going to be handed over from the Commission then to the European Parliament and member states. Interestingly enough, as you can see, the eIDAS regulation has a quite long history and has always been speaking about electronic IDs and also other trust services. So the A and the S is short for authentication and signature. And of course, coming from CA business, authentication and signature is at the core of our business portfolio. But in fact, our mother company, Bundesdruckerei, which is the German federal print, is also issuing the passports and ID cards for Germany. So, of course, the topic of electronic identification is also at the heart of our company group portfolio. And so, of course, we are delighted to note that finally the topic of digital identity really has entered the political debate. And I've given you two quotes here, both from very prominent ladies in European politics. On the right-hand side, you see our German Chancellor, Dr. Angela Merkel. And on the left-hand side, you see the EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen. And I'm going to start actually with Mrs. Merkel and the quote that she gave in the European Parliament when addressing the Parliament at the beginning of the German Council presidency. And basically, she stated here that the issue of digital identity will play a central role. And if we don't get this right across Europe, we'll have a fragmented single market. And of course, this is something that we have seen for a while in Germany, that Europe has this fragmented single market, and that we want to have a much more interoperable and open situation. So identity is a central role here. And coming to the Commission, here's a quote from Ursula von der Leyen, in fact, from the State of the Union address in September last year. Every time an app or website asks us to create a new digital identity or to easily log on via a big platform, we have no idea what happens to our data in reality. This is why the Commission will soon propose a secure European e-identity. And so we see that identity is a big topic, and it's a topic on the regulatory level, and it's a topic that has really reached the core of Brussels initiatives. And basically, what is the roadmap that we see before us here? Basically, there are three options that the Commission is proposing to follow up. So option one is really improving what is already there. So improving the coherence of the whole scheme, the consistency of the regulation, and of the interoperability of existing services and of new ones. So basically, this is a little bit make better what's already good and working. And option two is basically extend what we have done in the public sector to the private sector. Yeah, because the whole eIDAS scheme with respect to identity, it really comes from the public sector and from public services. And so the second option here really is extend the toolbox that we have to the private sector. And thirdly, this is what President von der Leyen really mentioned here, build and introduce a European digital identity scheme, which is more or less unified and incorporating all the different national eID schemes. So basically, these are the recommendations. And also what the new regulation will probably be framed out. So basically, as we see, there are national identities, there are national eID schemes, and these, of course, will be the foundation for the European digital identity. So what we are probably not seeing is a unified technology specification, but we rather see a scheme of interoperability between different existing national eID schemes. Now, the second question really is, how can we implement this? And of course, we know that Europe has a strong tradition of coming from a smart card thing. So we, of course, see that most European countries have already introduced card-based identification. But of course, we know that the future lies with mobile devices. So basically, the second pillar here is really to tie this identity to secure elements on mobile devices as a security anchor for mobile digital identity. Because in the end, of course, we know that most people growing up now accept services to work with mobile devices and to accept platforms to accept mobile devices. And thirdly, the question is, how is the whole trust service business going to evolve, especially when it comes to identities? And of course, we see that the classical identity, which is more or less based on certificates or PKI-based mechanisms, this is going to evolve further, both along the lines of classical cryptography, probably taking into account things like post-quantum crypto and other things. But of course, there are also SSI-based technologies, and these also will be incorporated. And all these different aspects in the end will then accumulate in what will be the second version of the eIDAS regulation. Okay, looking a little more in detail. So what is the outcome of what we've seen in the last years from the eIDAS regulation? So basically, one of the topics, of course, is making all these tools really mandatory for relevant law, not make this a choice, make it mandatory. The second is expand the use cases into the private sector. There are some success stories here already. So probably you heard, if you are familiar at all with some financial transactions in the European context, of the so-called Second Payment Directive, PSD2. And this is a good example for making use of eIDAS trust services to regulate, in this case, financial transactions. And in fact, this is probably a good example of how private sector can be regulated using existing eIDAS technologies. Then we have the topic of the so-called QBACs, Qualified Website Authentication Certificates. And again, I'm going to be covering this in a little bit more detail in a few minutes, but basically make this mandatory, require sensible sites to use this enhanced website certificates. And also ensure that there is a clear display of this in the appropriate browser technologies. And I'll cover this in a second. And then there are more technicalities here, offering the right referencing test infrastructure besides the production infrastructure. Make sure that you have the right technology in place. So basically HSMs, high security modules, and also the secure elements will play a big role. And in the end, there is the concept of harmonization, as always, always keeping in mind that Europe is per se a heterogeneous structure. So harmonizing what the different institutions within eIDAS are actually doing, so harmonizing what the so-called conformity assessment bodies, the CAPs, are doing, and also harmonize certification schemes for this. So basically, this gives you an idea and a flavor of the different, more detailed topics that we are covering here. And I would like to highlight two things here in special. So the first thing is CUBACs, and the second is Mobile ID. So basically, so what are CUBACs about? Well, CUBACs is really more or less the eIDAS version of the good old EV certificate, the EV certificate being a certificate that actually not only tests the technical control of a website, but also includes validation of ownership on a more organizational level. And you, of course, will remember the good old times when the EV certificate came with a green bar in the browser. If you look at current browsers, you won't find this anymore. And that's not by chance. In fact, it has been a policy within browsers to actually invalidate this positive indicators and basically switch all certificate types to the same view in the visualization. There are arguments for this in terms of complexity, but of course, there are arguments against this. And I think from the European point of view, the arguments against this really carry much more weight. So we feel very strongly that this is actually weakening the positioning of the responsible customer, in the sense that it's not easy for him or actually not possible to distinguish various types and to distinguish the trust levels. And of course, it's weakening this high-end certificate range, so to speak, because in the end, a domain validated certificate will not use a different indication for users as compared to a certificate where organizational attributes are in fact validated. And so this, of course, also implements a hindrance for the usage of qualified website certificates for website authentication. And basically this means as long as browsers keep on doing this, there is a restriction that is applied to European standards, and it means basically that over 500 million users are really excluded from the usage of qualified website certificates. And we strongly feel that this is a topic that should be discussed much more. And we still have the feeling that this is also an area where regulation is probably called for. Now coming to the mobile ecosystem, actually a lot has happened in the last years in Germany, and I'm going to focus a little bit on this. Right now in this year, we see that the German ID card, in fact, will come to the mobile phone. Bundesdruckerei has been leading a research project which is called Optimus on this, and this is actually going to go to production this year, and it basically means that you are allowed to transfer the identification attributes from your German ID card onto a secure element, and later make use of the various use cases of secure mobile authentication and registration just by using the mobile phone. And you see a bunch of different use cases here. Of course, e-government is a big topic. Hotel registration, if it's going to happen again after the pandemic has really eased, is a thing. Public transport, of course, is always a big topic in Europe. And there are other things like car sharing, mobile contracting, that all request for easy and secure identification. And we really feel that bringing a government ID onto the secure element of a mobile phone is going to help to move this forward a lot. And basically, this is the setup of the project that was funded by the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Energy for 3 years. So we were lucky enough to be the manager of the consortium here. But of course, you see a lot of names that you probably recognize also on a national, international level, like Samsung or Infineon or NXP or Telefonica or Deutsche Telekom. But of course, you see also some local players like universities, which is the suitable setup for such a project, really. Okay, so what was the goal of what we were doing here and what is going to production now? So basically, the strategic goals really were to supply some technology for ID provisioning and to enable them to offer mobile eID services at the eIDAS level substantial or high. So basically, eIDAS comes with 3 flavors of levels. So there is a low level, which is more or less just a password-based thing or something like this. And then there's substantial or high, and high really is the highest level that comes from an official document. And substantial is probably the level where the game is really won. And this is where secure element-based or any type of mobile technology-based identity is going to play. So the second goal was really to offer service providers relying on a certain security level, a secure, privacy-friendly platform for mobile services. So this is basically what's being set up and it's going to be in production later this year. And finally, of course, goal of the project as well was to offer the entry for small and medium enterprises and startups by setting up the right framework of technical and organizational provisions. So of course, SMEs always being very much in the focus both of the German government, but also of the Commission in Brussels. And interestingly enough, of course, this technology that we are deploying here can also be twinned with self-sovereign identity. So it can also work in the context of SSI schemes. And basically, the graphic here shows how the interrelation of this can work. So basically, there's going to be an issuer who either gives the digital identity to the holder, who can then store it in a wallet on his mobile phone, either using the Optimus technology or also some SSI things. And of course, when you want to use this, you can deliver some proof of some attributes or your identity to a verifier who is going to use this in some use case that is identity related. And of course, so this can work either on the mobile phone itself, or it can also work with some decentralized ledger technology things, where basically due to privacy reasons, then not the personal data, but some credentials related to this will be stored. And so this is basically a setup of an ecosystem that will come to life later this year, and is actually under close attention from the government itself right now. Okay, so looking at the time, I'm already coming to the end. So what are the main takeaways that I would like to propose to you? So the one thing is that, of course, modern mobile phones are equipped with the right hardware security gadgets to make sure that these can be used in a secure and trustworthy way to support identification and authentication in digital applications. And we've proven that successfully in the project. And of course, basically discrimination-free access to hardware security modules is key to that. And we really would like to encourage you to move this forward where possible. And finally, proving the identity of a website is actually an important gadget in establishing a unified digital trust space in Europe, and therefore much more attention should be paid to this also on the platform and browser level. Okay, summing up, we see that the Commission is really determined to make the coming decade the digital decade of Europe, aiming at a digital sovereignty. And of course, how they're going to do this, they are planning to regulate and push the digital and data economy forward and make Europe fit for the digital age. That is definitely upon us. So the DMA is really intended to introduce some ex-ante regulations for gatekeeper situations that are gatekeeping the digital economy, while the Digital Service Act is really providing new obligations for service providers who act in their role of connecting consumers with goods, services, and other content. The NIS, of course, is much more looking at an infrastructure point of view. So it's basically going to strengthen security requirements for companies by imposing a risk-based approach. And finally, with eIDAS in the revision, the Commission really wants to establish a clear framework for digital identities as a basis for trust spaces and digital economies. And of course, for all this, once more, hardware security modules in smartphones play a vital role. And finally, coming back to this point again, the use of QWAX really can strengthen trust in digital transactions and prevent misuse. And for this, I'm at the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you for your attention. And now feel free to interact both in the chat and in other ways. I'm open for questions. Thanks very much for your attention, and just keep in mind, better call Brussels if you want to make sure that you comply with the regulations of the European Commission. So thanks very much. Enjoy the conference, and all the best.